Now, what we have found out in this here, we would be talking about the departure from English language. You would see that, this starts with the past continuous tense, as they were traveling along this endless forest, and then the lady was following, and then he uses the past tense only, right? So he keeps on mixing it up, the simple past tense and the continuous past tense, right? Secondly, we would see that, there should have been used the past perfect tense where he has used only the past tense. For instance, he says, when he reached where he hired the left foot. It should have been when he reached where he had hired the left foot, right? And then he had hired all of that. But one thing that you would notice here, and you seldom notice in proper write ups in English, is the use of epithets. Now, what are these epithets? Does anyone know what are epithets? Now, basically, epithets are, adjectives, and these adjectives are found sometimes as word or sometimes as phrases, and that express a quality. Because these are adjectives, so they express a quality or a characteristic of a person. Now, you would notice here that this gentleman is never used alone. Okay, always an epithet is attached to him. He is a complete gentleman, he is an incomplete gentleman, he is a curious creature. Okay, he's just not a creature but a curious creature. He's at places he's said to be half bodied, and he's said to be incomplete gentleman. So at various places this gentleman is just not alone. Okay, some characteristic is attached to him. Similarly, um, epithets can be, describing the character's characteristic. For instance, telling about the lady what she was doing, she was following. About the gentleman, where was the gentleman? One is he was a complete gentleman, and then he was in the market. All of these, right? So there is an ample use of epithets here. Then there are examples of inconsistency in the use of tenses, especially the writer has freely used wherever he liked simple past tense, and wherever he liked he has used the continuous tense, and even at places where he should have used the uh, past perfect tense, as I have given you the examples. Okay. Now let's move to the last section of this chapter, which tells us about coherent model speech. Now, what we are doing in this section is whenever a writer wants to tell you the difference between speech and writing, because we already know that the language that is used in speech or for spoken purposes is different from that of written purposes, right? So, whenever the writer wants to introduce a character who is speaking, um, who's making a speech or who's speaking, so his structures are a little loose, and some flexibility is given to them, some flexibility is allowed to him, because the writer wants to tell us that a certain person is speaking. Okay, and it is not the writer who is writing, but it's the person who is speaking, right? So we will quickly look at the easier example where he tells us that the child is speaking, so that this model becomes clearer. But what we are told before we go back to doing the text, let's read it once, it would be of some help to you. It may seem self-evident to state that speech and writing are not the same thing, right? What are the differences? Speech is transient, that is, it's very quick, it ends very, very quickly. Unplanned, Okay, it cannot be recalled and it cannot be revised. Writing is fixed, it is considered, it is thought and planned. It can be recast or struck out. You can, if you have written something, you can delete it, you can rewrite it. But once something is spoken, um, you cannot do that. And speech is usually unplanned, right? um, so if we see some haphazard sentences or some dialogues or some lines in a novel or in a written text, those are acceptable stylistically, because here we are given the reason that the writer wants to show the spoken part in the text. Okay, and then it might reflect, the speech also might reflect the character's characteristics, his identity, his geography, his belonging, his first language maybe, that has influenced the speaking of English, right? Now, but there are differences of structure as well as medium and context. Sentences exist only on the page. The cohesive links within conversation linking topics may extend over many minutes. Some grammatical structures favor one form of a language over the other, right? And one more thing in a speech is, because a speech has intonation patterns, so there is a difference of punctuation marks when someone is shown to be speaking and when someone is being described as in writing, or some scenes are being described. So there's a difference. One of the defining characteristics of prose in the 20th century has been a willingness to experiment with features which are more often found in speech, from dialects to complete pattern of grammatical organization. Any writer who wants to mimic or draw on speech forms is faced with a major problem. The loss of prosody features such as stress, intonation, and pauses means that written language can carry much less information than the spoken form, right? So speech has stress, speech has intonation, speech has pauses that written language does not have. But if something spoken is tried to be produced in writing, then we would see how it is done. Either the reader or the writer has to work hard to make up this deficit. Okay. We will work with the intercalated clauses in a while in text 11, but we would be doing the last text first. Okay. Now, identify the pattern of clause linkages and the relatives in the following text. Why does the author use these patterns? Now, the first thing is, while we are speaking, the sentences are longer and there are more uses of intercalated clauses. By intercalated clauses, we mean that, sentences are longer and sentences consist of clause and then a dependent clause and the dependent clause with an independent clause. And they can, refer to who, which, the sequences of time, since, while, all of these. And then there can be conditional clauses with if. Then there can be relative clauses, what we are going to find out here, and the relative ones, which starts with that, which, who, all of these, right? Now what we are trying to do here is, while we will be reading, we can notice that, we will find clauses and longer sentences and repetition of the same similar structure that are not there in writing. Okay, for instance, it starts with and. So the main clause, and at this time I had a nanny that was William's sister, that had run away from home, and so she had to be a nanny, right? but very vigorous and affectionate was this nanny. That all of these that are part of relative clauses. Relative clauses can be um, a kind of subordinate clause. Okay, subordinate clauses are of number of kinds, and one of the kind of subordinate clauses are the relative clauses. Okay, so you will find a lot of relative clauses here. And at this time, I had a nanny. That was William's sister that had run away from home, and she had to be a nanny. But very vigorous and affectionate was this nanny that was called Elizabeth. And very strongly indeed she took to my mother, and very strongly indeed she raged against my papa. That was to her villain of the villa. She would not have one word said for my papa, but was always shaking her head and saying, "If the truth were known, and it can come to no good, and there will be trouble." So very soon I began to to rage very furiously against my papa. I sat upright in my baby carriage and wished Mamma hadn't made such a foolish marriage. Now, what is happening here? Sentences are long and they consist of clause within a clause. Okay, there is a main clause and then there is a subclause. And at that time, I had a nanny that was William's sister. That's a relative clause that had run away from home. And then there is subcoordinating clause, and so she had to be a nanny, right? And then there are other coordinated clauses. If the truth were known, that is a conditional clause, and it can come to no good, and there will be trouble. So there are several subordinate clause in the form of coordinating clauses, in the form of conditional clauses, and in the form of relative clauses, right? So you can easily make out that this is part of the speech. Someone is speaking, right? Now your verdict tells us, the verdict that is given to us tells us that this is a child who is speaking, right? Even his sentences are not well formed. He's taking help from a number of clauses together. Okay, so these are intercalated clauses, one clause within another other clause. And just to show that the character is a child who is trying to judge the marriage, and he's not very happy with the parents and their marriage, especially the mother, for selecting such a partner for herself. So what he is describing, and he's telling about his nanny also. This is just to there is of course there is a departure from the standard form of grammatical structures in English language, but stylistically, let me add some of your class fellows, but stylistically we cannot say that the text lacks coherence, but this can be justified through the speech model of coherence, because the writer wants to show us that a child is speaking. So this is permissible, right? Okay, now quickly let's do text 11 very quickly. We are going to do the same. Okay, we are going to work with intercalated clauses. I've told you that intercalated clauses are longer sentences, complex kind of clauses, clause within a clause, and there is just not one clause, but there are several clauses, okay, within a sentence, right? So there can be 2 to 3 clauses even. Okay. Now let's talk about the intercalated clauses. Now intercalated clauses, if you work with them, they are a part of spoken language more. How? Because in a spoken language, we discuss one thing, we are allowed to move to another and get back to the first one. Okay, for instance, we are talking about a person, then we talk about some place, and then we get back to the person again, right? So here you would find such examples, and this shows you that this lack of coherence can be justified through the coherence model of speech, right? For instance, there was a long silence, then she said, "What would I have to do, Arthur, on top of wearing the things?" Um, Now, as we are looking just not for the intercalated clauses, but we are also looking at the departure from the standard form of language. So there are many, right? For instance, instead of have, it is have. So some particular dialect is tried to be referred to, okay, or maybe some other language, person is speaking some other language, right? Okay, just hold on. Right. What would I have to do, Arthur, on top of wearing the things? Keep the occurrences book. This one, occurrence, you know, um, change of pronunciation here also. Instead of have, it says have. God help us. So some characters shown here that doesn't speak the her sound. Okay, and we have a community that doesn't speak the her sound. So God help us. What's that? Where they write the telephone messages down. Oh no, not me, not much. Why? Once at the Royal College, where I have worked these 15 years, they said, marry Miss Hoffman, and she was a nice girl. Now, look here. Not me, not much, right? Where they write the telephone messages down. Oh no, not me, not much. Why? Once at the Royal College, where I have worked these 15 years. So she is telling about his work, and then she refers to one of the ladies, Miss Hoffman, and she was a nice girl, and was glad to oblige. Now, instead of writing down Mary, Miss Hoffold, comma, a nice girl, and she was a nice girl, this is intercalated clause. Okay, Miss Hoffman, and she was a nice girl. You was glad, right? You would see here the auxiliary. Instead of you were glad, you was glad to oblige. Miss O, we called hers deaf today. Miss O, we called hers deaf today. Or I forget what. And would you mind answering the telephone through the morning? Okay. I expect it was a cold she had. Oh dear. Never again. I don't seem ever to get used to that instrument. Oh no, I could not. Well then, there is the kitchen. What? Me cook for a hundred? Oh my God. Right? So you will find, other than, the clauses are not properly structured within proper sentences, you will find a lot of departure from the proper language. And I think your verdict tells us that this is a Yorubo, the influence of the Yorubo language, right? So these are the spoken features that a certain character is perhaps is shown by the author. Okay, so it's a certain character with a certain kind of accent, and therefore a number of departures that I've already indicated here within this text, along with the presence of intercalated clauses. Okay, I think that's all for this chapter. We are done with chapter 4. You can analyze it more at your end. Now that I have explained you the basic models of coherence, and through which even texts like these, which show a lot of departure from not only from English but from coherence also, can be justified. Okay.